Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Jacob Condi, and today we're going to talk about Hurtado v. California, an 1884 U.S. Supreme Court case which was key in allowing states to avoid using grand juries in criminal proceedings and in helping lay the framework for how Bill of Rights incorporation would proceed in the following decades. In early 1882, Joseph Hurtado shot and killed Jose Antonio Estuardo after discovering that Estuardo was having an affair with his wife Susie. He was subsequently arrested, tried, and convicted for murder by Sacramento County, California, based on an information filed by a district attorney, as opposed to an indictment by a grand jury. Hurtado appealed the decision, arguing that it was constitutionally necessary for him to have been charged by a grand jury, but the California Supreme Court affirmed the decision of the Superior Court of Sacramento County. Hurtado appealed again to the United States Supreme Court, which agreed to hear arguments on January 22, 1984. Now, to understand this case, we first need to look at some key laws: the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and the Constitution of the State of California. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution reads, in part, "No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. Nor shall any person be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." In simpler terms, if you commit a capital offense like murder, you can't be charged or go to trial without an indictment by a grand jury, and you must also receive due process before being punished. However, the Supreme Court in previous cases has found that the Bill of Rights, of which the Fifth Amendment is a part, doesn't actually apply to the states, only the federal government. Oh, also, a grand jury is a group of 20-ish citizens convened to determine whether there is enough evidence to charge someone with a crime. They aren't convicting you, just seeing whether enough evidence exists to make going to trial worth it. The 14th Amendment reads, in part, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Now, this amendment is specifically targeted to apply to the states, and again brings up the concept of due process. The California Constitution, however, states in part that offenses heretofore required to be prosecuted by indictment shall be prosecuted by information, after examination and commitment by a magistrate. Basically, in California, offenses that prior would have called for a grand jury, like capital offenses, instead will receive an information, which is essentially where a prosecutor files a complaint against you, the judge reviews it, and then you go to a normal trial, just like if you would if a grand jury had indicted you. Hurtado believes that the California Constitution is in violation of the United States Constitution, and therefore his constitutional rights were violated. The 14th Amendment states that states must give you due process of law, which he argues incorporates or makes applicable to the states the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. They both state that a person cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Because the 14th Amendment incorporates this clause of the Fifth Amendment, he argues it also incorporates the clause guaranteeing a grand jury, which could be interpreted as a key part of that due process. As such, because he was not indicted by a grand jury, Hurtado's constitutional rights were violated. Now, the state of California disagrees. First, the case Barron v. Baltimore established that the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the states. Next, while the 14th Amendment states that states must provide you due process of law, it doesn't explicitly mention a right to grand juries. Because that right isn't explicit, California is perfectly within their rights to, under their own constitution, use informations instead of grand juries. So, what did the Supreme Court state? They ruled 7-1 in favor of the state of California, with Justice Stanley Matthews authoring the majority opinion. The Fifth Amendment Due Process Clause exists along with explicit guarantees that do not exist in the 14th Amendment, including the right to a grand jury hearing. Basically, he argues, if the writers of that amendment wanted you to have a right to a grand jury, they would have simply said so and put that in the 14th Amendment. The court did, however, determine that the 14th Amendment protects fundamental principles of liberty and justice which lie at the base of all of our civil and political institutions. But Jacob, you say, I don't care about grand juries. Why should I care about this case? Well, sure, grand juries aren't always the most interesting thing. Most of the time, the result of one isn't all that different from an information. New York Appeals Court Judge Solomon Watchler once said that a district attorney could get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. He himself would later be indicted, so it's unclear what that makes him, but anyways, this case goes way beyond grand juries and indictments. Up until this point, essentially the only way to incorporate rights to the states was either to amend the US Constitution to explicitly do so, or to amend your own state constitution, but this case started to change that. It introduced the idea that there are some fundamental rights and liberties and freedoms that the states are not allowed to violate. This started the long process of incorporation. Because the justices said that the states can't violate fundamental rights, but didn't actually say what they were, the Supreme Court has had to go clause by clause through all of the Bill of Rights, determining what is fundamental and what's not, in a process that has continued to this day. The Supreme Court only incorporated the protections against excessive fines found in the Eighth Amendment in 2019. But it was Hurtado confirming we did have fundamental rights that really got that ball rolling. So whether or not you care about grand juries, if you value the rights to free speech, religion, bearing arms, or whatever, Hurtado has impacted your life.